Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lunchtime lecture series. This is an annual series of interesting and scholarly talks presented jointly with Public Programming and the Beckman Center for the History of Chemistry. My name is Sarah Heymans. I'm a research associate at Université Paris-Cité in France and a short-term fellow at the Science History Institute. It's my honor today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Louis Gerdelan. Before I do so, I just want to say a little bit about the format of our series. Louis will speak for about 40 minutes, after which there will be a Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. Just make sure that you're signed into your Google account. And you can also email your questions to us at lunchtimelectures@sciencehistory.org. Now, to introduce today's speaker, Louis Gerdelan is a historian of the early modern world with a particular focus on the British, Spanish, and French empires. His work joins the history of science with intellectual and environmental history, and he's currently writing a monograph that examines how knowledge about disasters, particularly earthquakes, storms, and epidemics, developed in the 17th and 18th century Atlantic world as a result of the research practices that scholars began to adopt in this period. This year, Louis is a Haas postdoctoral fellow at the Science History Institute, where he's concentrating on uncovering the ways in which chemistry, meteorology, and medicine combined within the context of disaster research. Before coming to the Science History Institute, Louis completed his PhD in history at Harvard University in 2021, and received a number of fellowships, including from the Consortium for History of Science, Technology and Medicine, the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium, the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, the Omohundro Institute, and the North American Conference on British Studies. He has published work in the journal Studi Storici and has a forthcoming publication in the Massachusetts Historical Review. For the next academic year, Louis will be taking up the Solmsen Fellowship at the Institute for Research in the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome, Louis, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that great introduction. It is really a great pleasure to be here speaking with you all today, and particularly a privilege to round out this series of lunchtime lectures for this academic year. Let me start with a question. Does disaster have a history? I say history, but I don't mean in the sense of a chronicle, a recitation of incidents or a description of their effects upon societies. I'm referring to history as the record of dynamic processes that we can analyze and from which we can draw glimpses into our deep cultural structures. Susan Sontag once wrote that the imagination of disaster, quote, does not greatly differ from one period to another. In her view, only the politics and morality of disaster change. I'm going to have to respectfully disagree and say that there is almost nothing fixed about it at all. In this age of climate crisis, we have seen that the incidence and severity of disaster can change dramatically. The impacts on the environment and on human communities also vary according to specific social conditions. But in addition to their material dimensions, disasters have important intellectual, emotional, and cultural components that transform them from mere anomalies to events that are full of meaning for us. And this complex immaterial layer is also a site of great change. If we're to understand our relationship to extreme fluctuations in our environment, especially as these become more and more frequent, then we need to treat the intellectual or epistemic aspect as a serious object of study with a history that can be recovered. The early modern period, that is, between roughly the 16th and 18th centuries, forms a particularly promising zone for historical disaster investigation because of the wealth of documentary evidence generated by catastrophic discourse of one kind or another. Thanks to the work of historians and other scholars, particularly over the last 3 decades, we know a great deal about how disasters affected early modern societies on the practical level, but we know far less about how the inhabitants of these societies comprehended them and how their understanding, or I should say understandings in the plural, changed over time. tracing changes in ideas and attitudes in the past is, of course, a very tricky undertaking, particularly if we want to take them on their own terms rather than imposing a reductive model upon them. Given the lack of more sophisticated explanations, historians, as well as sociologists, anthropologists, and philosophers, have often been attracted to a rather straightforward story of secularization and modernization. Narratives of this kind of disenchantment vary, but for many, the big jump towards modernity occurred in 1755, when Lisbon was struck by a huge earthquake, soon followed by wide-ranging debates that drew in such luminaries as Voltaire, Rousseau, and Kant. In my view, this particular modernization story is rather too generous to us moderns, who are not nearly as rational and well-informed about catastrophe as we sometimes imagine ourselves to be. If we scroll our minds back just over the last couple of years, I think we'll find plenty of examples from our own experience. Moreover, when we place the Lisbon earthquake into a much longer context of catastrophes and their interpretation, it becomes fairly clear that many of the seemingly modern features of the discussion at that time, in fact, had much earlier origins. With these points in mind, it should be obvious that there are many questions remaining about when and in what directions disaster knowledge developed. Those are obviously very large questions, and we need a suitably large geographical scope to address them. I've chosen to focus on three of the great empires, Britain, France, and Spain, which allows me to consider evidence from both Europe and the Americas. There are a couple of reasons for a geographical focus on what historians call the Atlantic world. Firstly, this large region was the location of particularly dense informational networks, and you'll see why I think this was important shortly. Secondly, it allows me to show that the kind of knowledge being produced in the leading scientific centers of Europe was often dependent on actors and environments that were very distant from those places. So the story of early modern disaster knowledge I offer is not so much a Eurocentric story as one entangled in empires and other structures of authority. It's also a trans-regional history in which the movements of people, ideas, and physical phenomena themselves, such as viruses, seismic activity, and storm systems, played a key role. What it emphatically not is a neat procession of scientific discoveries marching in the direction of modernity. Instead, I see it as a contested and reversible set of developments, which involve not only scientific techniques, but also humanistic, especially historical ones, and not only innovation and collaboration, but also marginalization and sectarianism. I focus on the period between roughly 1605 and 1755, that is between the publication of Francis Bacon's Advancement of Knowledge and the Lisbon earthquake. And the reason for this chronological delineation is that, in my view, this 150-year period witnessed profound and demonstrable transformations in the way in which contemporaries interpreted disastrous occurrences. The documentary evidence for disasters in this era is extremely broad in nature, including scholarly treatises, early newspapers and gazettes, printed pamphlets, including printed images like the one you can see, almanacs and sermons, handwritten diaries, manuscript notes, personal and bureaucratic correspondence, and the records of institutions such as governments, town councils, religious orders, and scientific societies. We also need to bear in mind some of the complexities of the early modern intellectual milieu. This was a world in which science, typically referred to as natural philosophy, and medicine interacted in a very fluid way with other types of inquiry, and indeed the boundaries were far from clear. Astrology and theology had overlapping interests with natural philosophy in making sense of catastrophic events. Given these complexities, I think of the world of early modern disaster ideas as an expansive and evolving intellectual ecology in which various elements continue to coexist throughout the period. Overall, I argue that the radical changes of the period took place not at the level of world views, but as a product of the choices that interpreters made in turning perplexing events into knowable phenomena. And these cumulative actions changed the shape of disaster knowledge without necessitating a secularization of fundamental beliefs. I've become particularly interested over the last year in how early modern people acquired information about disasters, especially natural philosophers, but also governments and religious orders, And as we'll see, the boundaries between these three groups could be quite porous. So I'm going to focus on this aspect of information transmission today. In principle, anybody could engage in the interpretation and remembrance of disasters, and the evidence suggests that people of all social classes and of all kinds of communities did generate opinions about both very recent incidents and episodes from the past. Personal observation and reflection did not require an elite education, and the collective memory of past catastrophes was a shared resource. However, an individual's access to disaster information and to current discussions depended to a large extent on social position, access to libraries, and the possession of personal or professional networks. Unsurprisingly, therefore, scholars, bishops, and bureaucrats could often command far greater informational resources than farmers, shepherds, or sailors. On the other hand, farmers, shepherds, and sailors had an immediate stake in knowing about the incidents of extreme weather and tended to have more first-hand familiarity with its manifestations than their sedentary counterparts. As a consequence, the observational testimonies, recollections, and even gossip of all kinds of people played significant roles in the overall development of early modern disaster knowledge. Scholarly disaster research was thus often the product of unequal and sometimes involuntary collaboration between educated writers and informants of lower social ranks. At the same time, information also flowed in the reverse direction, particularly in the form of cheap printed material such as news pamphlets and almanacs. These could be produced directly by scholars. Some almanacs, for instance, were composed by well-known astrologers or cosmographers, but many others were the work of journalists or printers who were not members of a learned elite, but had a degree of access to both scholarly books and news networks. I would suggest that it was the increasing range and density of these kinds of interactions across different social groups and between different societies that made possible significant intellectual change about disasters in this period. Such interchanges had, of course, occurred earlier, but in a more piecemeal fashion. The rapidly increasing circulation of print, the emergence of a transnational republic of letters, the expansion of imperial rule, and the growth of maritime commerce together undergirded the accelerating transit of information in this area of the world. In the shadow of those very broad transformations, a variety of actors struggled to learn and write about disasters for several reasons, not just curiosity, a very loaded term in this era, but also the desire to enhance confessional or political legitimacy or to delegitimize opponents, and the need to govern subject populations more effectively. But people also wanted to find out about disasters in order to predict them and either prevent them or mitigate against their damage. I think this perceived societal utility of disaster knowledge separates it out from other kinds of inquiry in an interesting way. Prior to the middle of the 17th century, knowledge about disasters for the most part occupied a nebulous position in the scholarly world. Although writers frequently referred to earthquakes, epidemics, storms, volcanic eruptions, and other phenomena, they tended to assign them ultimately to a highly eclectic category of calamities or misfortunes, which included every imaginable form of mishap, both personal and collective. The word disaster itself, a term derived from astrology, connoted misfortune, literally ill-starred. Founded on the twin pillars of scripture and classical Greco-Roman literature, this ambiguous concept proved both pervasive and resilient. The hallmark of this deep-rooted epistemic framework was the location of negative occurrences with an ambiguous category of misfortunes, in which earthquakes and storms shared space with the rebellions and wars, religious schisms, personal afflictions, and the prodigies of nature. The Hebrew Bible frequently lumped afflictions with quite different symptoms together, sometimes in groupings of numbers with mystical significance: the 3 arrows of God, famine, plague, and war, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and the 10 plagues of Egypt. In Jeremiah 24:10, God threatened to send the sword, the famine, and the pestilence, while in Matthew 24:7, there was prophesied famines and pestilences and earthquakes. On the other hand, God's mercy also promised deliverance from the same ambiguous grouping of ills. In 2 Chronicles 6:28, the Lord undertook to deliver the suppliant righteous of Israel, quote, "If there be dearth in the land, if there be pestilence, if there be blasting or mildew, locusts or caterpillars, if their enemies besiege them in the cities of their land, whatsoever sore or whatsoever sickness there be." Patristic writers fused the scriptural account of the tribulations of the Hebrews and their neighboring peoples with the similarly ambiguous concept of misfortune in the Greco-Roman world. However, although preachers found the vagueness and dogmatic associations of the concept of calamity useful, as 17th century scholars tried to expand the sum of knowledge about destructive phenomena, it became increasingly apparent that new and clearer forms of classification would be needed. Nevertheless, it is possible to find hints in works from the first half of the century for what a new epistemology of disasters might look like. A systematic arrangement of knowledge into categories that emphasized the physical characteristics of destructive phenomena and that distinguished elemental forces from turmoil in the civil sphere. I won't go into these works in great detail here, but suffice it to say that a number of programmatic works appeared, beginning with Francis Bacon's Advancement of Knowledge in 1605, which tried to reimagine the shape and configuration of knowledge, amongst other things, separating catastrophes in the civil sphere, like civil wars, from ones associated with the elements, earthquakes, storms, and so on. As Bacon made clear, the key to crafting these new studies, or histories of environmental hazards, was in the collection of reliable data. But this turned out to be much more challenging than it sounds, and the pursuit of this objective played a major role in molding what disaster knowledge became. Around the middle of the 17th century, this process of changing the framework of understanding was expanding and accelerating. A key reason for this was a marked increase in discussion about disasters. There were obvious geopolitical and commercial motives for knowing which areas were affected by storms, earthquakes, or plagues. Disasters also possessed a cultural significance at the time that is not always so apparent today. Viewed through a Christian religious lens, calamities were crucial pieces of God's communication with the world. Although different denominations stressed different aspects, clerical interpreters in general tended to view disasters as divine judgments upon communities for sinfulness, and so they became indispensable occasions for political and social reflection, as well as tools to advance projects for spiritual conversion or moral reformation. These pieces were already in place at the beginning of the early modern era, but the availability of information about disaster events dramatically increased over time. Certainly by the middle of the 17th century, Europe and its empires were participating in, to purloin Robert Darnton's term, an early information society. But as we know from our own experience, the proliferation of news does not necessarily equate to an increase in knowledge. In fact, looking more closely, we can see a dance of dueling dynamics involved: awareness and surprising ignorance, widespread reporting about some events, and complete silence about others. Alongside the genuine news, there was a surging tide of fake news, and much like today, contemporaries, including natural philosophers, sometimes found it difficult to differentiate the one from the other. There was also a genuinely great deal of disaster news to report on around this time. The 1640s to 50s marked a period of extraordinary political turbulence, sometimes described as the general crisis of the 17th century. This coincided with a marked climatic downturn in the wider process of global cooling known as the Little Ice Age, which produced extreme meteorological conditions and led to, among other things, severely cold winters, recurrent harvest failures, and widespread malnutrition. Alongside these conditions came a vast convergence of disastrous phenomena on both sides of the Atlantic. Among these disasters was a devastating plague epidemic in the Mediterranean, with severe and long-lasting demographic impacts. The plague spread across southern and eastern Spain and the Balearic Islands between 1647 to 54, killing about 20% of the population of Barcelona, 30% of Valencia, 35% of Cordoba, and 50% of Seville. Overall, Spain lost some 500,000 people from this catastrophe, almost 6% of the population it had possessed at the beginning of the century. Entering Sardinia and then Naples, the plague subsequently spread through most of southern and central Italy, including Rome. Spanish-ruled Naples, which suffered some 150,000 deaths, roughly half of its inhabitants, only recovered its pre-plague population levels in the 1730s and 40s. At the same time as the Mediterranean world reeled from the plague, a deadly new phase of epidemics swept the greater Caribbean. The first outbreak of yellow fever in the New World afflicted Barbados in 1647, migrating to the Yucatan in 1648, and Cuba, Guadeloupe, and St. Kitts soon after, killing 20 to 50% of local populations. The disease traveled to Puerto Rico in 1648 and to Florida in 1649. New Spain, that is Mexico, experienced a severe smallpox epidemic between 1646 to 48, which coincided in Mexico City with floods and yellow fever. In the Yucatan, a deadly combination of disease, drought, and acute food shortages in 1648 to 56 may have halved the region's Mayan population. Guatemala experienced consecutive outbreaks of 3 different diseases at this time: influenza, cucumates, and plague, while in the province of Quito, a city councillor estimated the combined mortality in 1648 from measles, diphtheria, and smallpox at 100,000. Even huge mortality figures like these are small compared to the vast demographic losses that had resulted from Europeans' introduction of diseases to the New World in the first phases of settlement. Nevertheless, the 1640s and 50s were remarkable in the way that overlapping epidemics of different diseases afflicted both Europe and the Americas at much the same time. We can consider this period as an unusual but significant point in the longer process that Emmanuel Leroy termed the unification of the globe by disease. While both continents had suffered great epidemics in the past, of course, seldom if ever has a concurrent mutual experience of this kind of catastrophe linked them in such a conspicuous way. In addition to these outbreaks of disease, the middle decades of the century constituted a period of significant and widespread seismic activity. In 1647, one of the most destructive earthquakes of the early modern era ruined the city of Santiago de Chile and killed perhaps a fifth of its population. Another catastrophic earthquake struck Cusco in 1650, while a smaller seismic episode destroyed many buildings in Santiago de Guatemala in 1651. An earthquake in Lima in November 1655 caused only minor damage but generated serious alarm. Churches remained open night and day, processions implored God's mercy, and preachers took turns giving continuous, round-the-clock sermons at 3 competing pulpits in the central square. A far more destructive earthquake and tsunami in Chile in 1657 ruined much of the port of Concepcion, although the death toll remained low because most of the inhabitants were able to flee in time. In Quebec, settlers, missionaries, and indigenous communities expressed amazement at the dramatic effect to the landscape of an earthquake in 1663. A more destructive seismic episode affected the Peruvian cities of Pisco and Ica the following year, reportedly killing more than 400 people. In Europe, French royal propagandists had to react rapidly to an earthquake of 1660 in the Pyrenees, one of the strongest in French history, in order to counteract the impression that God frowned upon the reign of the new king, Louis XIV. Not long afterwards, the so-called accession famine, famine de l'Avènement, caused around 1 million deaths in the north of the country. Plague also struck northern France in 1663-4 and 1666-70, while the so-called Great Plague devastated London in 1665-6, killing over 100,000 people. In 1666, the most destructive urban fire of the age razed central London, signaling the beginning of a new regime of major conflagrations that repeatedly wreaked havoc in the city. The waves of disaster events between 1646 and 1667 that I've enumerated here were endlessly reported and analyzed through the rapidly expanding news media. Several genres of writing conveyed news of catastrophic events, including gazettes, compilations of reports on various affairs of note ordered by city, which sometimes included accounts of plague deaths, earthquakes, storms, and other kinds of destruction. Narratives of specific events also continued to be printed in the long-standing format of cheap sensational booklets. These included English broadsides and pamphlets, Spanish relaciones de sucesos, and the productions of the French Bibliothèque Bleue. Usually anonymous, these productions offered narratives of events that recycled a range of emotive tropes, often with a moralizing message about the divine punishment of sins and the necessity of repentance. A Spanish pamphlet account of the Great Fire of London, for example, stated unequivocally that, quote, God has permitted this scourge of fire, together with that of the plague and the war, in order for the English to suffer for their sins. A third avenue for the communication of news was private correspondence, which could both report events and offer commentary upon them. In the 17th century Republic of Letters, correspondence became a crucial means for natural philosophers and other scholars to learn and disseminate information on recent disasters. Some individuals within this community cultivated immense personal networks that crossed national and confessional divides, enabling them to act as information brokers. Such intelligences included Henry Oldenburg and Samuel Hartleb, savants who settled in England from Bremen and Danzig, respectively. The establishment of learned societies, such as the Royal Society in London, 1660, and the Académie Royale des Sciences in Paris, 1666, allowed reports to be shared more widely, since at meetings members read aloud some of the accounts of extraordinary events and phenomena that they received in their correspondence. Furthermore, the printed periodicals of these institutions disseminated a curated selection of accounts to a broader reading public. The very first issue of the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions in 1665 included accounts by Robert Boyle and John Wallace of a minor earthquake in Oxfordshire. A number of independent periodicals also emerged at this time, such as the Journal des Savants, also beginning in 1665, which conveyed accounts along similar lines of extraordinary phenomena and disaster events for an educated public. While intelligences served the needs of individual scholars and the fledgling scientific societies, long-distance information networks also expanded over the 17th century to accommodate government bureaucracies and religious orders. The Spanish bureaucrat Juan Díaz de la Calle, Oficial Segundo of the Secretariat of New Spain, received reports of earthquakes in such distant locations as Caracas, 1641, Tenerife, 1647, accompanying a volcanic eruption, and Santiago de Chile, 1647. The governing councils in Madrid needed to be continuously apprised of disasters because of their grave implications for security, economic production, commerce, and political stability. Communications between the metropole and the overseas provinces took so long that, much like other aspects of colonial administration in the Spanish Empire, local officials and elites had to take responsibility for the immediate practical management of disaster situations. Nevertheless, the emergence of Díaz de la Calle's empire of paper allowed the bureaucratic infrastructure to transmit important disaster news more efficiently. Well-connected savants could sometimes get access to imperial news networks. The government official and natural philosopher Robert Southwell, for instance, was able to funnel an official report on the Jamaica earthquake of 1692 to the Royal Society. Finally, ecclesiastical networks circulated detailed reports of disasters between parishes or missions, provincial dioceses, and metropolitan bases. After the earthquake in Quebec in 1663, the superior of the Jesuits in New France, Jérôme Lallemand, sent a report of the event to the general of the order at Rome, Gian Paolo Oliva, while the account of another Jesuit writer, Charles Simon, found its way to print in France. The progressive expansion of each of these means of conveying news over the 17th century enabled the increasing circulation of information about disasters. The growth of long-distance communication was particularly important because it opened up sources of news about the extreme destructive phenomena of the Americas, especially the hurricanes of the Caribbean and the great earthquakes that devastated Spanish-American cities. In the first half of the century, English and French scholars such as Francis Bacon and Pierre Gassendi possessed very little information on these occurrences and relied heavily on a few brief observations from scarce 16th century printed works, most notably those of Oviedo, José de Acosta, and Pietro Martire. In contrast, by the 1660s, the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher, based at the Orders College in Rome, was able to draw on both an extensive network of nearly 800 correspondence and Jesuit documents for his research on earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. These he combined with his personal observations of an earthquake in Campania in 1638 and of the volcanic activity of Etna and Vesuvius. He famously had himself lowered into Vesuvius's crater to observe the magma close up. Publishing treatises and essays disseminated not only ideas and personal observations, but also precious testimonies of destructive natural phenomena, which was crucial for scholars who lacked large networks of informants. Thus, Kircher's Mundus Subterraneus, the subterranean world, published in 1664-5, which assembled much of his earthquake and volcano research, in turn functioned as a crucial mine of information for other researchers over subsequent decades. The Royal Society quickly published an approving review and summary of the book, and an abridged English translation appeared in 1669. A Jesuit correspondent of Kirches based in Spain, José de Zaragoza, recycled a considerable portion of Kirches earthquake and volcano data in his own treatise, Esfera en Común, Sphere in Common. However, as the circulation of information about these phenomena expanded, so did concerns about the credibility and authenticity of testimonies. In one sense, this was merely a reflection of a broader trend. The growth of news media in general provoked countercurrents of skepticism that questioned the accuracy of news reports and generated what the historian of the news, Brendan Dooley, terms a new feeling of uncertainty about the world. However, the problems of accuracy and authenticity were magnified in the case of disasters because they were characterized by extraordinary occurrences. Moreover, much 17th century writing about these events was intertwined with the heterogeneous sphere of preternatural occurrences, since disasters were often associated with portents, visions, and prodigies like rains of fire or blood, rains of toads, rains of stones or wheat or butter, talking trees or animals, as well as apparitions in the sky of armies or ships or swords, and so on. To some extent, skepticism about stories of destructive phenomena shared in a nascent critique of these prodigy and judgment tales more broadly, which emerged partly as a consequence of the way in which religious sects and political factions blatantly exploited these stories for propaganda, since judgments and the wonders of nature were often taken as expressions of God's approval or disapproval of one side in a conflict. However, examples from Canada to Chile also reveal the existence of a much broader transatlantic trend in this period toward questioning the truth of claims about disasters and their associated prodigies. This was not a complete paradigm shift. The reporting of prodigies did not simply disappear. However, an important current of doubt had emerged that gained strength over time and demanded new evidentiary standards in disaster research. A remarkable incident in 1656 demonstrated the dangers of credulity concerning tales of disasters and the extraordinary impact that false or exaggerated accounts could have. In September, English warships near Cádiz captured a young Spanish nobleman, Francisco López de Zúñiga, the eldest son of the Marqués de Baides, former governor of Chile. The teenager, whose parents had died in the fierce sea battle with the English, proceeded to feed his captors a series of increasingly elaborate stories about an earthquake at Lima the previous year. The young Marquis gave the English naval officer the astonishing news that 12,000 people had died at Lima, that the city had sustained severe damage, and that in Chile the Andean tribes were on the brink of launching a major rebellion. Stanier conveyed López to Lisbon, half-starved and dressed in rags, where he impressed the leading English naval official, General at Sea Edward Montagu, as a most ingenious and intelligent youth. By this point, López's account had taken on prodigious and almost apocalyptic tones, involving, quote, the fearfulest earthquake and raining of fire from heaven that has ever been heard of in the world. López now claimed that the city was not just damaged, but entirely swallowed up by the earth, along with the port of Callao. He further related that the famous silver mountain of Potosí, the most important source of Spain's bullion supply, had been completely leveled with the plain. There could be no possibility of mining precious metals in the Viceroyalty of Peru ever again. López claimed that to recoup these great losses, the Spanish king would be forced to open the secret, hidden gold mines of Hispaniola. This account must have raised exciting possibilities. Thanks to the disaster at Lima, Oliver Cromwell's failed Western design of the previous year to conquer Spanish America might now be revived, making use of the newly acquired island of Jamaica as a forward base. A renewed assault on Hispaniola, whose small garrison had earlier humiliatingly rebuffed an attack by the English fleet, would hand to Cromwell's Britain the mineral resources it needed to build an empire. A jubilant Secretary John Thurlow duly conveyed this remarkable news to Henry Cromwell in Ireland, though with the prudent proviso that, quote, because this is the first time we have heard of it, it is thought necessary to have it seconded by other hands before we do give full credit thereto. Meanwhile, Montagu brought López and one of his brothers with him when he returned to London, lodging them at his own house and treating them as honoured guests. Oliver Cromwell himself met the young Marquis, greeting him in Latin and tearfully commiserating the loss of his parents, before assuring them that he was no prisoner and would be returned to Spain at England's expense. As it turned out, however, the story of the disaster was a tremendous exaggeration. A strong earthquake in November 1655 had indeed caused some damage and widespread alarm. At least 2 people died, and families slept outside for some time out of fear of further destruction. But the city had not been engulfed in the earth, fire had not descended from the skies, and Potosi continued to yield precious silver for the Spanish crown. Whether the ingenious and intelligent youth had consciously determined to deceive his captors from the outset, or whether he himself had heard only a muddled account of the earthquake during his sea voyage, is unclear. In either case, he embellished the event in a highly imaginative way that cleverly played upon English geostrategic ambitions. As a whole, the incident both revealed the immense impact of news about distant disasters and demonstrated the vital importance of obtaining accurate information. Cases like this powerfully reinforce the point that extraordinary claims about elemental destruction needed to be weighed carefully. But whose testimonies could be trusted? In the era's intensely hierarchical societies, it made sense to weigh evidence on a sliding scale of credibility according to social rank. Peasants and other members of the so-called vulgar lower classes were notorious for believing in all kinds of fanciful tales, so their evidence needed to be treated with great caution. Priests and ministers, on the other hand, were presumably likely to report the truth, but they might also have sectarian motives for retailing certain stories. The testimonies of educated gentlemen tended to be most readily accepted in scientific circles, especially if a member of one of the scientific societies could vouch for them as, quote, sober, curious, and honest. In some cases, fidelity was established by having several witnesses co-sign an account of events. The accounts of indigenous and enslaved people, especially people unconverted to Christianity, were treated with particular skepticism, although they could not be ignored since they were at times the only reports available for some regions. This was the case in 1663 when Quebec experienced the earthquake I mentioned earlier. The Jesuit report written by Charles Simon is full of wondrous occurrences. The ghost of the martyred missionary Jean de Brébeuf had allegedly uttered premonitory warnings. Pious women dreamed of rampaging demons and impending divine judgments. Traders reported seeing a fiery city in the air surrounded with whirlwinds, and a monstrous spectre was observed at Quebec City, while porpoises were heard to wail and bellow near the town. This was all perfectly fine, but when it came to the testimonies of unconverted Native Americans who lived outside the sphere of French authority, Simon thought some doubt was necessary. Quote, either they really saw these things, or, as happens in troubled circumstances, thought they saw them. Interestingly, Simon tended to accept the holy visions of Christian Native Americans concerning demons and apparitions and so on at face value. The concern with credibility exercised a major influence on how Europeans perceived non-European knowledge traditions about disaster. In the 16th and early 17th centuries, settlers in the Americas relied on indigenous knowledge on how to live successfully with environmental hazards, such as hurricanes in the Caribbean, floods in the Valley of Mexico, and earthquakes on the Pacific coast of South America. But subsequently, Europeans gradually started to portray this knowledge as superstition, not unlike the vulgar beliefs of the European peasantry, but mingled with a non-Christian mythology that made them especially problematic. The Jesuit missionary and historian Diego de Rosales devoted a chapter of his History of Chile, completed in 1674, to an assessment of the region's earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. On the basis of his understanding of indigenous legends, which associated the volcanoes of the Andes with the spirits of past chiefs, Rosales commented that these were merely the fables of a people ignorant of natural causes. From his perspective, modern natural philosophy would dispel such myths. The shift from mining indigenous knowledge for practical utility to casting it as vulgar and superstitious reflects a broader rhetorical strategy among those with pretensions to natural knowledge in the European empires. Similar attitudes can be detected in reports of events in Islamic lands, where Europeans imagined a kind of religious fatalism reigned, based on ignorance of natural philosophy. Thomas Smith, chaplain to the English ambassador in Constantinople, spelled this out in his account of an earthquake of 1669. Quote, the Turks look upon earthquakes as ominous, as the vulgar do upon eclipses, not understanding the philosophy of them. Smith sneered that the English contingent were soon rid of the fears in which this frightful accident had cast us, while the Turks made direful reflections on it, as if some calamity would inevitably fall upon the empire. Given this derision, it is perhaps ironic that a much less significant set of tremors in southeastern England in 1692 provoked a great outpouring of anguished pamphlets and sermons about God's wrath and the fearful prospects for the nation. All of this suggests that we need to bear in mind the complex processes of exclusion, policing, and critique that accompanied epistemic change. At the same time, the long-distance exchange of information and the emergence of evidentiary standards did gradually help to move the investigation of disasters from an uncritical or propagandistic repeating of prodigy tales to a more sophisticated research apparatus. I started the talk with a quote by Susan Sontag, so let me close by thinking about something she wrote in her book, Regarding the Pain of Others. Being a spectator of calamities taking place in another country, she says, is a quintessential modern experience. Sontag had in mind the direct viewing of photography and video, the products of undeniably modern technologies. I want to flip the quote on its head, though, to say that being a reader and indeed a collector of calamities taking place elsewhere was a quintessentially early modern experience. The project of reshaping disaster knowledge relied on the collection of accurate information about calamity, but in trying to ensure that accuracy, the people involved in this project made decisions about what was and was not legitimate. This selection fundamentally changed the way that scientific knowledge, as an abstract and collective endeavor, related to the individual's lived experience of catastrophe. That was the deal made by the early modern people who sought access to the Earth's dreadful treasury. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk, Louis. So we have about 18 minutes for questions, and while we wait for questions to come in, let me just use my privilege as the host and ask one of my own questions. So you mentioned, or you discussed a lot of these this transmission of information through these long distance information networks, and I was wondering if you ever come across information coming in from outside of these three empires that you study. Was it kind of a global exchange of information that came in these European societies, or was there a clear link with empires and the interest that they may have had in them?
That's a very good question. Thanks, Sarah. But what I've tried to demonstrate is that the information networks are kind of key. So the Atlantic world is useful to study because there's this very dense set of informational relays going between imperial outposts and Europe. But of course, Europeans did have interest in other areas too. So information about events in, for instance, Asia did also make it into these kinds of networks. And I do find references, for instance, to earthquakes in China, storms in South Asia, and there were, of course, imperial outposts and trading posts and commercial interests as well throughout what's called the East Indies, and Southeast Asia particularly. So yeah, there certainly is connection with the wider region, and I'm not trying to be exhaustive with my own study, but I think there's certainly room for reflection on global processes as well. Perhaps using this as a case study or an illustrative study. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have a question from ML. Were medical disasters viewed and understood differently than natural disasters such as fires or earthquakes?
Well, that's a question, and I think this gets to this underlying issue that I tried to signal early on in the presentation, that categorization became an incredibly important part of this process of reimagining disaster. And this was a process that occurred throughout, and was championed by various different people. So it's sort of impossible to say that everybody thought X about these kinds of events. I think it's better to think about how individual researchers tried to group and classify the information that they had available to them, and in ways that they thought made most sense. And I think that is actually kind of important because if you'll remember back to the start of the presentation, I pointed out that the very old concept of calamity tended to group everything together in this big cluster. So definitely plagues and other kinds of epidemics would have been in the same category as fires, earthquakes, but also things like carting accidents or deaths in the family. So almost anything negative could be a calamity. But as the period went on, I think the work of the kind of researchers and scholars that I've been talking about proceeded to introduce categories and taxonomies into these kinds of questions. And I alluded to Francis Bacon very briefly because I think he is quite an important early figure in trying to separate out the so-called elemental and civil types of calamities. So that might also be an important milestone in this transition. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so while you were talking, 3 more questions came in. Watching to Learn asks, were there different approaches or reactions to disasters in British versus French versus Spanish contexts?
Yeah, that's another excellent question. I think if we're treating this from the point of view of informational availability or access to kinds of to knowledge about these kinds of events, the Spanish Empire actually had a huge advantages in some ways earlier in this period, in the 17th century, particularly in the first half of the 17th century. They had already been in the practice of generating questionnaires about things like populations and issues that related to governance for their empires. And from the late 16th century, they started to introduce questions about hurricanes and volcanoes and epidemics and things as well. So they had this huge kind of bureaucratic information collecting apparatus that the other empires simply did not have. And another thing they did was mandate the depositing of shipmasters' logbooks with the state. So they also had a kind of fairly comprehensive record of the storms and ocean hazards that captains encountered as they sailed across the Atlantic or other parts of the world. So Spain certainly had an information collecting advantage. It doesn't necessarily mean that Spanish natural philosophers were able to tap into this information, because as I suggested earlier, access to information was actually quite unequal and depended very much on social and professional or official position. So there are kind of interesting disparities there as well. But yeah, we can kind of draw these big distinctions between who knew what about disaster.
Okay, thank you. That's so interesting. So our next question is from Eduardo, who asks, since the Renaissance's reappraisal of ancient sources about disasters like Pliny and Aristotle, I was wondering about their impact on early modern natural philosophers. And then there's another comment. Did they consider these ancient sources reliable enough?
It's a great question, Eduardo. Thanks. Ancient sources were absolutely very, very important for natural philosophers in particular. We see huge reliance on Aristotle, on Pliny, on Seneca, even from people that we would, if we kind of take some of the old narratives of the scientific revolution for granted, that suggested there was a huge move against Aristotelianism and a reassessment of classical knowledge, when we might expect people moving away from this. But actually, a lot of these classical frameworks continue to be very important. What kind of happened in terms of challenging them was a number of really huge disasters, or really extensive disasters in the late 17th century, started to call attention to some of the kind of limits of what the classical writers had imagined, because they simply, Aristotle and Pliny had never been to the Americas. They didn't know about the kind of huge seismic events that can be had in the Pacific coast of South America, for instance, or They had never seen hurricanes. So the range of events needed to be expanded. Seneca had imagined something like 100 miles was the total maximum limit for an earthquake to affect. But as the new information came to be kind of filtered through these networks that I've described, it became possible to kind of critique that and say, well, actually, we have pretty good testimony that events extended a lot further than that. So the imagination of how disasters could work started to exceed the classical one, although that's not to say that people stopped reading those classical sources, because they still remained kind of interesting, both in theory, but also as collections of data that people could then kind of harness into current theories as well.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Becca Jackson. What was the relationship between secularism and religion to an interpretation of disasters as victimizing people who deserve empathy and aid in the aftermath?
Oh, very good question, Becca. It's quite complex, actually, because there were several different possible Christian responses to disaster victims, or they called them sufferers at the time, usually. So yes, it was quite possible to, I guess, do what we would call victim blaming, but attribute the suffering of these people to their own faults or their own sins, or at least the sins of their community, and that did happen. But at other times, we find people really sympathizing with the plight of these people and offering charity. So charity was supposed to be a really important Christian aspect of Christian practice, theorized differently in Protestantism and Catholicism, of course, but there was a kind of movement towards benevolence as well, and we can see that coming through in the sources quite clearly. So there's a sort of a tension between different opposed possible responses. But this all goes to show that, when interpreting disasters, early modern people had access to many different possibilities, and they could move between them as the occasion dictated.
Okay, thank you. So James Vogel asks, do you sense a decrease in astrological explanations of disasters, especially those involving weather, during this period?
And that's an excellent question, and it's quite a complex one, actually, because it depends a lot on the areas that you're interested in. The classical narratives of historical narratives of astrology, as you'll know, tended to focus on England. But if we then bring in Spain and especially Spanish America, the situation becomes quite a bit more complicated. So in England and France, you see this big kind of rise of a critical movement, particularly from the mid-17th century, partly prompted by massive waves of panic about eclipses and comets and so on. And you get kind of well-known natural philosophers and other critics like Pierre Bayle, for instance, writing huge anti-astrological works. But then Spanish America continued to have quite a syncretic approach to using astrology throughout the 17th century and even through the 18th century. So, I mean, I've seen there's a really interesting book by a guy called Unanue at the beginning of the 19th century, which combines kind of stellar influences with all kinds of different geophysical explanations and electricity, and there's all kinds of different modes of explanation. So the Spanish Americans had a kind of amazingly syncretic approach to understanding these kinds of events, and they would use whatever seemed to them to be most practically useful and most helpful as an explanatory tool. And they weren't too worried about the kind of either or sense of explanation. Either we use Aristotle, or we use the kind of mechanistic science being developed in Europe, or we use astrology. They were happy to grab bits and pieces from all over.
Thank you. So let's take one last question from Bono Shi. Was the reporting of disaster different from that of other newsworthy happenings? And is there any implication for a history or historiography or history of historiography in general?
I think the history of historiography is probably beyond my ambitions just at the moment. Yeah, I think there are many points at which I think this disaster reporting fits into a general story about news and print culture, and also oral culture, oral transmission of rumors and so on within this time period. I think it does stand out in certain ways, partly because of the nature of the events involved, partly because they so closely seem to interrelate with religious messaging, God's signs of approval or disapproval and so on, partly because they affect societies and empires in particular ways. So, for instance, hurricanes affecting shipping, for instance. But of course, all of this news was emerging alongside things like war. I mean, the 30 Years' War, that kind of thing. So there was a bigger news environment as well in which this kind of transmission of information participated.
Okay, thank you so much. So it looks like we're out of time for questions for today. So I'd just like to thank you again, Louis, for a fantastic talk. Thank you, everyone, for your questions, and thank you as well to Louis for these really interesting answers. So if you're interested in seeing more from the Science History Institute, including updates on our programs and events, you can check out our website at www.sciencehistory.org or follow us online at scihistory.org on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you again so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.